Hey guys, I'm Philip Molina, and this is a breakdown of Game of Thrones Season 6, Episode 4, Book of the Stranger. And this season is moving along very fast, and this episode is packed, so I'm just gonna jump right into the analysis and theories. Let's start with the opening images. The opening shot shows us Jon Snow's sword, Longclaw, and after walking off and saying, "My watch has ended" last episode, this image represents that fact, that Jon is literally laying down his arms. Now, last episode I talked about the Night's Watch oath, and I think it's worth pointing out that everyone said that Jon is safe because he died, which would clear him from his oath. And yeah, I pretty much agree with all of you, but I think it's very interesting that this episode starts with that exact same debate about whether or not that's technically true. Because like Ed reminds us, the oath also says for all nights to come. So again, I'm down with Jon saying, yeah, F that oath, but also we gotta admit, it's not just simple black and white. He's gotta choose to walk away from that oath. But let's just go ahead and move on to the biggest emotional payoff this episode, maybe one of the biggest ones of the series.
Open the gate!
Jon and Sansa's tear-jerking hug. It's the first of 3 brother-sister reunions in this episode, and after waiting for a Stark family reunion for years, I think everyone watching was like, holy crap, this is more emotion than I've felt in years, like in my life. According to my Twitter poll, this was your favorite moment of the episode, but it's interesting that this is the one we get, considering Jon and Sansa have never actually spoken to each other on this show before. I think one of the reasons it still hits us so really hard is the music really works. Something we rarely hear is the full House Stark theme, and that's what we're hearing here. This episode was actually the first to feature the full playthroughs of several major character scores, including the Stark, Lannister, and Targaryen themes, but I'm gonna mention those kind of as they come. Oh, also real quick, yeah, Tormund is totally effing Brienne as she rides past him. Clearly he wants to make a giant baby with her that might be the stallion that mounts the world or something. Brienne's reaction though I love is just grabbing her sword, which is like a threat from her, but it's exactly like up his alley and probably makes him want her more. I'll get back to that hot Brienne Tormund romance later. So moving on to this sweet brother-sister scene between Jon and Sansa, this whole interaction actually really mirrors Ned and Catelyn in season 1 when Ned didn't want to go south to fulfill his duty, but Catelyn urged him that it was the right thing to do. Now Sansa's become the duty-driven badass, and she drinks beer now, by the way, and she's saying she's gonna take back Winterfell alone if she has to. Sansa has gone full Stark now. She's even wearing the Stark wolf furs that we saw her wearing maybe last only in like season 1 probably. So imagine if I'd asked you at the end of season 1, right after Ned is beheaded, hey, which Starks do you think are gonna become the badasses that are gonna avenge the family name? I don't think you would have guessed it'd be the dainty lady Sansa and Jon Snow, who's not a fully legitimate Stark, and he's a brother of the Night's Watch who's supposed to completely stay out of the politics of the realm. Pretty surprising. I just want to point out how this episode has a lot of Sansa kind of standing up for Jon Snow, reminding everyone that he's half Stark. I feel like that's actually got to be a little bit of this journey that Jon has to go. In the idea of him having to go back and reclaim Winterfell, it also would mean that he has to newly and finally claim himself as a Stark. And so I feel like that's maybe what Sansa has to be able to bring to her brother, is a reminder that he really is a Stark. Whether or not he does end up getting legitimized, he just doesn't seem to really believe that himself right now, but I feel like that is also an arc that we need to see play out before he's really ready to go take back Winterfell. Now before I move on, I want to point out a shot that kept appearing in this scene with Sansa and Jon both being boxed in by the scenery. In the very next scene, we find Davos and Melisandre framed the exact same way. If you think about it, these are all characters who we've wondered what would happen if they were actually finally put in a room together and forced to deal with their shit. Sansa and Jon have been reunited for minutes, but now here they are, boxed in together, having to face what has happened in Winterfell. It's kind of like a parent putting 2 quarreling siblings in a room until they figure out their problems. And then Davos and Melisandre, they've been pretty distracted lately, what with all the resurrecting, but they haven't had a chance to deal with what we've all been wondering. Like, shouldn't Davos be all like, hey, what exactly happened with Stannis and Shireen? So here they are, caged in together, having to deal with their drama and answer these tough questions. Then we get a third instance of this a second later when Brienne joins in, because as she reminds us, she also has beef with Melisandre since she played a huge part in killing Renly. So this framing device, it's meant to underline the fact that there's nowhere to run anymore. These characters are finally being put together and they have to deal with their stuff. That caged in framing, meaning that you've got nowhere to go, having to face what has happened, it's probably a cinematic reference to the old Fritz Lang film M, where the technique was maybe most famously used to show how actions have led a character to be metaphorically and visually trapped. But moving on to the eerie. Finally, we see where Littlefinger has been this season. Bird shopping. No, actually, I think there is a big clue in this moment that's being dropped as to what Littlefinger has really been up to, but I'm not ready to discuss that theory just yet. I will be in this video though, so don't worry. I'm just gonna ask you to please remember this moment.
My lord, come and see. I missed your name day, go on.
Now, as for the gift he has for Robin, the falcon is part of the sigil for the house Aaron, and you see it on all their banners. You kind of even see it in Robin's cloak. The kid loves falcons, and it's actually one of the many callbacks to other times we've had in the past on the show. This episode is just full of these kinds of callbacks. If you remember back in season 4, Littlefinger returned to the Eyrie bearing a gift for Robin, and that time too it was a falcon. Though that one was made of crystal, and Robin immediately dropped it out the moon door. He's such a little dick. Also worth noting, when Littlefinger calls him
the defender of the Vale,
it's immediately followed by a really long shot of Robin dropping his bow and arrow, which is another instance of laying down your arms, but in this case it's just ironic because yeah, defender of the Vale, this sickly kid is not. And that's even considering that somehow he grew like 3 feet taller since the last time Littlefinger saw him. He's definitely being made fun of by calling him defender of the Vale. Oh, and I quickly want to point out here what is going on when Littlefinger turns the tables on Lord Royce with this story about getting captured by the Boltons. Now, this is a complete lie. He willingly went to the Boltons and gave them Sansa, but this is one of those stories that Littlefinger loves to tell to manipulate the situation and get his way. I will come back to this idea of telling stories to get your way, but let's note, this is a huge win for Littlefinger. In this moment, he finally gets the Knights of the Vale involved in the wars of Westeros.
We should help her.
that was my instinct as well. Our Lord has spoken.
They've never gotten mixed in because Lysa was so crazy and paranoid, and that's what she got so mad at Catelyn about for asking for her help with. So now Littlefinger just brought in a very fresh, very well-rested army that has not lost a single soldier to any battle lately. And in fact, it's quite possible this could be the largest army in Westeros right now. Though don't quote me on that, I'm not 100% sure. We only know for sure that because Jaime tells us that the Tyrells have the second largest, but I wouldn't be surprised if these untouched Knights of the Vale are the largest. And they're now all under Littlefinger's control. So well played, Peter. Speaking of Littlefinger, when we move on to Meereen, Littlefinger actually is the clever man that Tyrion is quoting when he defends his decision to negotiate with the slavers.
As the clever man once told me, we make peace with our enemies, not our friends.
You might remember Littlefinger saying the same thing to Ned Stark in season 1 about the Lannisters.
We only make peace with our enemies, my lord. That's why it's called making peace.
It's interesting how far Littlefinger's influence reaches in this world and just how often he's the one behind things, but I will get to that later. So here the heads of Astapor, Yunkai, and Volantis arrive on these ships with harpy sails, and we know these are the men who are big fans of slavery because that sigil, it's holding up chains that represent slavery, and that's why Tyrion's 7-year proposal is actually a really smart move. Real quick, the creators of this show compared Tyrion's dilemma to Abraham Lincoln's dilemma. He had also tried to use his negotiation skills to end slavery and avoid a civil war. But remember, Lincoln did not stop that civil war from happening. So I gotta wonder, is Tyrion gonna suffer the same fate? If not, if he somehow avoids war, then have no doubt George R.R. Martin is saying that Tyrion would make a better president than Lincoln. Small thing here, you might remember this guy as the slave trader who bought Tyrion and Jorah last season and now is running things in his town, and Rosdal Khal is the rich guy from whom Dany declines his votes. And I might be misremembering it, but I'm pretty sure she like half seduces that guy in the books by just like leaving one of her boobs out during their whole conversation. But anyway, this third guy, who's he? According to the credits, that's BELICHO from VOLANTIS, and we've never seen him before, but a fun fact about that character name, BELICHO is the name of another character from the books, and it does not matter at all that they're not the same character. The point is, George R.R. Martin named that guy after the New England Patriots head coach, Bill Belichick. You see, Martin famously hates the New England Patriots and their coach, Bill Belichick. He wrote about how evil the guy is. So anyway, while Martin was writing the most recent book, the Patriots had that undefeated season until they were beaten by the Giants in the 2007 Super Bowl. So the BELICHO character in the books, he has an undefeated reign as well until he's literally eaten by giants. So that's fun. Point is, this guy might not be too long for this world. Okay, now when Tyrion has to explain this decision to the people of Meereen, a few interesting things happen here. First, we see he's in Daenerys' throne room, but very purposely they show him walk away from the throne, coming down the steps to speak to these people at their own level. That's very different from Daenerys, but then he also gives them this long list of things that he is not.
But I am not your ruler. I am not the breaker of chains. I'm not the unburnt. And I am certainly not the mother of dragons.
That's the direct opposite of Daenerys' approach. She sits above everyone else and she makes them sit through a long list of her titles.
You are in the presence of Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, Queen of the Andals and the First Men, Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, Breaker of Chains and Mother of Dragons.
Like Littlefinger, Tyrion tells a story to manipulate people. Supposedly, Daenerys has come up with this 7-year plan, except she didn't. And supposedly, Grey Worm was a big part of these negotiations, and he wasn't. And Missandei even picks up on this knack of telling stories or telling lies by quoting that same Littlefinger quote, but pretending it was some wise man, all to manipulate these people of Meereen and get their way. There's a lot more of this strategy soon. By the way, if you think I'm being harsh on Dany's style of rule, I actually don't intend to be at all. It's just a different style of rule. Daenerys Targaryen is a conqueror through and through. That's how you define this kind of person that just kind of takes what's in her way. And honestly, I mean, she is replacing it with better systems. It's not the worst thing. Tyrion is just more of the great negotiator, if you will. And I think realistically, that's why these two really need to come together. If they are ever going to be these great rulers of Westeros, you have to have both the negotiation skills and the conquering skills. It's like the Mr. Miyagi's theory or whatever, where it's like you really should avoid a fight as much as you can and try to negotiate.
Julissa, fighting not good.
But like Miyagi says, and any good Karate Kid knows, if you do have to fight, well, then you want to conquer on your side. You want to win.
But if must fight, win.
I think you actually do need to have both of these in order to actually successfully rule any kind of world or country or fictional world. But moving on, Daario and Jorah joke about riding the dragon as they hide their weapons, and did you notice how obsessed with this knife Daario is? He kisses its butt. It might be because it's his lucky knife. Remember, this is the same knife that he used to take down the horse of the champion of Meereen. Considering it ends up saving Jorah's life too, it's probably also now his lucky knife. Okay, so then in the Temple of the Dosh Khaleen, we see another shot of Dany staring into the flame torches that fill the room, and I think I explained the importance of her staring into those flames enough in our last episode breakdown. Do check it out though if you want to see just how much foreshadowing they did for the big finale of this episode. But let's move on. Anyway, worth noting, the other widows don't trust Dany because they don't think Dothraki should dilute their bloodlines by breeding with outsiders, and Dany actually knows better than anyone how dumb an idea that is. The Targaryens were obsessed with keeping their bloodlines pure through incest, and it's probably why they were so crazy. That said, I actually don't know that Dany isn't gonna end up with a Targaryen at some point, but we will cross that gross bridge when we get to it. Quickly, I also want to point out how the Elder Widow tells Dany the story of Lazarine, the young ex-Khaleesi who kind of looks like Rihanna. It's another example in this episode of a character using a story to manipulate someone into taking a certain path. In this case, the story is supposed to convince Dany that being kept in this forest forced retirement home is actually a good thing. She could have had much worse, supposedly. Except Dany's like, yeah, I'm not buying it. Like, she knows she probably would have just killed that khal in his sleep or something. Now, moving on to the dungeons kind of below King's Landing, Margaery watches this millipede crawl up the wall, and I think this shot's pretty intentional. Millipedes are known for burrowing themselves deep underground, like how Margaery's portrayed here. And despite what people think, they actually don't have a lot of options for defense. They don't sting you. Instead, they roll up in a tight ball and they just try to hold on for as long as they can. That's Margaery right now, burrowed deep, regularly being attacked, but just trying her best to just hold tight until she's somehow saved from this situation. And she has been pretty damn resilient. But okay, let's talk about this scene with her and the High Sparrow that leads to the name of this episode. He starts to lecture Margaery with the story of his past, but kind of like Dany earlier when she's hearing a story, she's like, yeah, I've heard this one, I'm not buying it.
Book of the Stranger, verse 25.
You know the seven-pointed star?
Scepter and Ella reads it to me.
Okay, so Book of the Stranger is the title of this episode, but here's why. It has to do with what's going on in this scene. So first I'm gonna point out to you that the High Sparrow and this story about the shoes, yeah, he's lying. We've already heard a different story for why the High Sparrow is barefoot. He told Cersei last season that he gave his shoes away to someone who needed them.
Why no shoes?
Because I gave them away to someone who needed them more.
So this means that this story he's telling, it's just another one of these stories that people tell in this episode to manipulate someone into doing what they want. And the Book of the Stranger is just a story from their version of the Bible. Like, sure, there's some interesting stuff about the fact that the Book of the Stranger is basically all about death and how death binds all men. The Stranger is the Westeros version of death, sure. But more importantly, this is basically how religion works in general. A bunch of stories are passed down through generations, all to just manipulate people to behave a certain way. So it's not that the text of the Book of the Stranger is terribly important, otherwise we would have heard a lot more of it. It's just a famous example of how everyone uses parables or stories to get what they want. In this moment, it's the High Sparrow who is trying to control her and sway her into confessing, and normally, like Littlefinger and Tyrion, the High Sparrow is actually pretty good at this manipulation. But what's interesting here, though, is when he's using a story and he's speaking from the book, it's not really working because she's like, yada yada, I've heard it, boring. So he tries a different manipulative tactic that I don't think Margaery realizes is happening. She gets to see Loras. It's our second brother-sister reunion of the episode, and they go back and forth about being strong.
You need to stay strong.
That's a reference to their Tyrell house words of growing strong. But then Margaery says she's got it all figured out.
And if either of us give in to what they want, then they win.
They want her to go in and help break down Loras. But what she doesn't realize is that she is the one being manipulated here. The High Sparrow knows Loras is already broken, and he's using him to break her. At the end, she's actually the one that gives in to Loras, begging her to help him make it stop.
Just make it stop.
I think this is the very moment where Margaery gives in and the High Sparrow's manipulation seems to win her over. At least I think that she is kind of quitting her defiance right now. It is worth noting that we don't see her again this episode. So it feels like the telling stories didn't necessarily convince her, but he's a pretty badass manipulator, and this does seem like it broke through. So I gotta wonder how that's gonna play out for her atonement story versus the one that Cersei has planned for her. Okay, now these next two scenes contain a ton of clues that I think might be setting up a big twist, so let's just break it all down and then you can let me know if you think this is gonna happen. Tommen tells Cersei that the High Sparrow told him something.
There's something I want to tell you. Something the High Sparrow told me.
And based on the tears in his eyes, it feels like it's something big. And I know it's semi-implied that maybe he just told him that Margaery's gonna have a walk of shame on like Tuesday, but we actually never hear Tommen say that. We just hear Cersei say that. And if my theory is correct, we should not trust her at all. I mean, even if my theory is not correct, we should not trust Cersei at all. So I think the High Sparrow told Tommen something else. And just before Tommen tells Cersei what that thing is, she puts her hand over his heart and we get a carefully designed shot that shows us this ring. That ring once belonged to Joffrey. You might remember it from his death scene. So I think the High Sparrow actually told Tommen who killed Joffrey, the Tyrells. Loras clearly has spilled everything, and that secret is known within his family. And so in this scene that we abruptly cut away to, before we hear Tommen say the words, Cersei and Jaime suddenly have this elaborate plan for supposedly saving Marjorie from a walk of shame and taking out the Faith Militant, killing the High Sparrow, and yada yada. It's all just way too damn tidy for me. Instead, let's remember what this episode is all about: telling stories to manipulate the situation. So I think instead, Cersei is setting up vengeance against the Tyrells for having killed Joffrey, and she's killing two birds with one stone. She's gonna pit them against the Faith Militant, whom she also hates. And my current guess is while they're at each other's throats, Cersei's gonna find a way to seize power away from her uncle Kevin and take control of that Lannister army and somehow crush the Tyrells and the Faith all at once. This would also once again give her the upper hand in King's Landing. And I think this is all being foreshadowed by that music in the background. You hear that? That's the Rains of Castamere, the same song we heard at the Red Wedding the last time the Lannisters pulled a deceptive trick against another house. Now, of course, yes, this is all just a theory, and it's mostly based on the fact that we see Joffrey's ring, but I think it's also telling that something big is coming, because did you hear what Pycelle was warning Tommen about? What the big thing they must not do is?
I have dealt with fanatics of every description, Your Grace. Not setting them off. That's the most important thing.
They can't set the High Sparrow off. Tommen makes the same warning.
You have to be careful not to antagonize him.
So whatever happens, I have a strong feeling an attack on the church is coming, and even if Cersei does have a plan, I just think it's not gonna go how anyone expects. Doesn't it just feel like everyone is underestimating the High Sparrow in this scenario? Like, so whoever ends up being on top, and the Marjories and the High Sparrow and the Lannisters, I think it's gonna be a surprise to most of them, at least, who that ends up being. Actually, this was all predicted, by the way, by an old riddle that Varys told in like season 2.
3 great men sit in a room: a king, a priest, and a rich man. Between them stands a common sellsword. Each great man bids the sellsword kill the other 2. Who lives, who dies?
Varys' conclusion is that
power resides where men believe it resides. It's a trick. A shadow on the wall.
It's a trick. It's like a shadow on the wall seeming scarier than it is. In this coming conflict, the Lannisters represent the king, the Faith Militant represent the priest, and the Tyrells represent the rich man. Each of them has a different kind of power, but whoever comes out on top depends on who's the best at making it seem like they have the most power. Who can make the spookiest shadow on the wall? I would argue it might not be any of them, but I'm gonna get to that shortly. We then get a third brother-sister reunion with Theon and Yara in Pike, and it's another one of these callbacks that this episode keeps doing. It's very similar to the last time that Theon returned to Pike, and both times he received a very icy welcome, except the first time he was wearing fancy clothes and was way too cocky, and now he's so completely broken, and before, it was his father, Balon, who made him feel like garbage, and this time it's his sister Yara filling that exact same role. She even sits in her father's salt throne and is just as bitter and salty as that old man was. Though I gotta admit, her paranoia is fairly legit, since Theon's arrival is very conveniently timed, and she thinks it's because he thinks he's the rightful king of the Iron Islands now. In yet another example of telling a story to get your way, Theon tries to tell Yara the story of how Ramsay broke him, but just like Daenerys and just like Marjorie, Yara's like, yeah, I've heard this one. In fact, I got a written letter about this one and it came with a wiener in it. Oh, and that was also a letter from Ramsay Bolton about a kidnapped loved one, which makes the later letter yet another callback. Okay, so then we move on to Winterfell, where Ramsay peels an apple, evoking the sigil of the Boltons, the flayed or peeled man. So that's Sansa and Wolfer, Robin with the Falcon, Marjorie and Loras talking about growing strong, Dany and fire in a moment. It's a big episode for characters connecting to their family roots. I don't want to dwell on this moment with Osha too much because it's a bummer, but I will say that it is another callback to another time when she tried to seduce the current Lord of Winterfell. And I will also point out that her lie, this story about how the Starks kept her prisoner and they made her serve them and yada yada BS, it's just another attempt at using a story to manipulate. And Ramsay's just like, oh yeah, I've heard that one, but also I'm Ramsay, so throat stab. Oh, also Ramsay talks about the stories that Theon told him.
I had to work hard to get him talking, but he talked. They all do.
That's another way to look at what the High Sparrow has done to Loras and why I think that Loras has told him everything, including Joffrey's murder. There are a lot of ways you can torture a person. Dragging them to church is a pretty famous one. Moving on from this, I really hope it doesn't mean anything that our edit smash cuts from dying Osha to the flayed man's sigil. Killing her is bad enough. I really don't want to know if he's gonna skin her too, though supposedly it is gonna happen to somebody this season. But moving on to this scene and the letter that this writer brings. Well, there's this so awkward dinner scene with Tormund making his eyes at Brienne and Ed having none of it, and then the letter gets read. Now, in the books, this is called the pink letter for the pink wax stamped with the Bolton sigil. It's also called the bastard letter because it's sent from one bastard to another. But the most interesting difference about the letter in the books, there it's very unclear exactly who sent the letter. Like, yeah, it's implied that it was Ramsay, but so many details are left vague that it really feels like it could have been anyone. Now in the show, it's a little less vague. Like, I know we just saw a Bolton writer deliver this letter, so you'd think, well, that has to come from Ramsay Bolton. But let's just pretend that maybe writers can be paid off, and let's look at some of the other possibilities. Or maybe just one other possibility. Okay, so first, a moment ago, I showed you the last time Ramsay sent a threatening letter. It was to the Greyjoys, and that letter had a yellow seal, not pink. But okay, so if it's not Ramsay, then why would someone send this? Who would benefit from it? Well, there's a clue in the repeating chorus we hear throughout the letter.
Winterfell is mine, bastards. Come and see. Come and see.
Come and see.
Now, do you remember that scene I asked you to remember earlier? No, you don't? Oh, doesn't matter. I'll just show it to you anyway.
My lord, come and see.
Didn't that feel like a very forced in line? Like, he did not need to say that, and he definitely didn't need to word it that way. So yeah, I'm saying, what if Littlefinger sent this letter? It would make a lot of sense, actually. First off, where has he been all season? In the past, we've seen him jump from the Eyrie to Winterfell to King's Landing, all in a few episodes. But now, he's been coming back from Winterfell forever, and we didn't see him during any of that time. So what if he actually has been orchestrating a plan with Lord Umber to hand Rickon over to Ramsay, and then he lets Jon know in this letter to force Jon and his wildlings into a battle with Ramsay. But why would he do that? Good question, camera. Because if you remember, Cersei promised she would make Littlefinger Warden of the North if he could take Winterfell back from the Boltons.
And if you succeed?
Name me Warden of the North.
So if he sandwiches Winterfell between Jon's army and now the army that he just brought into the fight, the Knights of the Vale, that seems pretty doable. Also, by the way, if he does get made Warden of the North and he's given Winterfell, he will now control 3 out of the 7 kingdoms of Westeros, counting the Eyrie through Robin, the Riverlands through Harrenhal, and then potentially Winterfell. That's one away from a majority. This guy's always 10 steps ahead, and the fact that we don't know what he's been up to lately makes me think, yeah, it's probably been a lot. He's probably up to so much. I will get back to Littlefinger in a second, but let's wrap up the episode. Okay, yeah, so here we are at the closing images. After wiping out all of the khal leadership, and without the help of her dragons, by the way, but definitely with the help of fire, Dany emerges from the flames naked and unburnt. It's another callback, this one to the iconic season 1 finale. Normally I compare the episode's closing images to the opening images of that episode, but I actually think this one is meant to be paired with the opening images of the last episode. This time, the closing images show rebirth through fire, and last episode opened with a rebirth through ice. Theirs is the Song of Ice and Fire. And the Ice and Fire prophecies actually aren't the only ones being touched on here. There are at least 2 others that are being referenced. One, back in the House of the Undying, Dany was told that she would light 3 fires, 1 for life, 1 for death, and 1 for love. The first fire brought life to her dragons, and this second one brought death to her khal enemies. I feel like we're probably gonna see Dany light 1 more fire before this series is over, maybe for love of some kind, except I think that one is gonna be on the other side of the Narrow Sea. But speaking of seas, that's the other prophecy that I feel like is being touched on. The Dothraki saying that Dany recently repeated, where she talks about the sun rising in the west and setting in the east, and I explained what that could mean in a different breakdown. Well, the next part of that refers to when the seas go dry. Well, Dany just became the leader of pretty much all of the the Dothraki. Like, based on the fact that Khal Drogo's Khalazar was like 40,000 people, and there were at least 7 khals here that were just recently defeated, I think we're easily talking about more than 100,000 Dothraki under her command right now. So pretty soon, when it's time for her to take these men across the ocean to Westeros, maybe on the ships of the Iron Islands, maybe, that's gonna completely drain this land here of Essos. There's not gonna be any Dothraki left here. And what is this area where they roam called? The Dothraki Sea. The sea will be dry. By the way, another quick reason why I think this might be where we are eventually headed, George R.R. Martin has based much of this story off of real world history, and well, way back in the day, Rome was like the fanciest place in the world, and they just like ran the show. Then some familiar stuff started to happen. There was the polytheistic religion, meaning they worshipped a bunch of gods, kind of like the gods of the Seven, but then Christianity came in, and it started to really confuse people with this idea of there being only one true God, a Lord of Light, they called him. That sounds familiar, right? So this really destabilized Rome, and as its power players were distracted and bickering amongst each other, around Europe and Asia, other forces grew stronger. Specifically, the Huns were this roving force of nomadic warriors who were terrifying. You might remember them from Mulan, a terrifying movie. They actually even kind of look like the Dothraki. So now, them and Attila were a huge threat to Rome. However, the Huns had their own enemy that they battled with a few times. They also were scary nomadic warriors, and they were known as the Visigoths, or just the Goths. Different kind of Goth, but still same word. Now, at the end of the day, because of the pressures that the Huns were putting on the Goths, and after some merging and some scaring and whatnot, it was actually the Goths who famously sacked Rome. So while it wasn't the Dothraki looking Huns, even though they did play a huge part in it, it was the Visigoths who were the nomadic warriors who overtook Rome. And if you're wondering, what did those Goths look like? Oh, they were just famous for their pale skin and very light hair. So yeah, I think Dany is going to lead the Dothraki against the armies of Westeros. But okay, wrapping up this breakdown and my thoughts on Littlefinger, it's really appropriate that this episode, Book of the Stranger, all about the stories and tall tales that people tell in order to manipulate others, it's the same episode that brings Littlefinger back. He's the king of that. He's the best storyteller, if you will. In the riddle from before, I think Littlefinger is the one who would win because he's the best at making people perceive power from him, and he ultimately seems to have the most influence over people. I recently reminded you guys that he's the reason the whole Game of Thrones happens, because of his plot to murder Jon Arryn. And I think that's all because George R.R. Martin is Littlefinger, or at least that's who he thinks he would be in this world. Martin has stated that he thinks one strange change from the books to the show is that Littlefinger became pretty in your face with his villainy. In the books, Littlefinger is super well liked. Everyone thinks he's awesome, but also he's not really like a point of view character. We don't focus on him much, and yet he's still the one that's pulling all the strings. He's the master of the entire story. He's the author of the book. He's George R.R. Martin, and this Game of Thrones story is just a story he's telling us to manipulate our feelings. Game of Thrones, the novel, is the Book of the Stranger. They're both just telling us a story of how all men must die. Okay, and I'm gonna try something new. A lot of you have been asking me about next week's episode consistently and my thoughts on the promos, and I thought, well, why don't I just watch the promo live with you here in this video, and then I'll just tell you what I think of it as we go. In the future, you let me know if you want these to be part of these breakdown videos. If not, I could do it somewhere else on my Twitter or Facebook or something. But this time, here's a sneak peek at a possible segment. Let's watch the promos.
Sansa.
Did you know about Ramsay?
So good question, right? Did he know that Ramsay is a freaking psychopath? He is supposed to know everything about everyone, so I don't know, maybe he probably did know, but he loves Sansa? I don't know. My point is, I think we're gonna have a little tables turn there. You can kind of see the energy there. She's got Brienne, her like badass sword there. She's got this like intensity. I think finally, Sansa's actually gonna be the one that's gonna surprise us, like, oh shit, she's kind of in charge here, and I think it's gonna be very interesting to see Littlefinger's reaction to that. Moving on.
Does death only come for the wicked and leave the decent behind?
Arya and Jaqen, and he gives her poison. We didn't see any of that this story, but the way I remember we're leaving it, she's been given this new chance. She can now see, and it is interesting that it's okay, she's really on the other side of her training. We had that badass training sequence the other time. So I feel like this is kind of a reset now, like a redo of here you go, here's poison to go kill somebody. Do you want to be a faceless man? And that I think is a really interesting question, because even though she's gone through all of this, we all know that Needle, her sword, Needle, is still hiding there under some stones. I feel like as long as Needle's around, Arya Stark is still kind of around. Especially, I keep predicting this is the year of the Starks. I don't know. It's a very interesting way that they're posing the question now. Do you want to poison people? That's our job as faceless men. You sure you want to do that? So I'm curious at her answer too.
Who makes a claim?
I claim the Salt Throne.
So next we get that King's Moot with Yara claiming the Salt Throne. I feel like pretty obvious, right, that it's well, Euron is standing somewhere nearby, right? He's probably going to at least contest that. He did just kill their king for this reason. Yeah, that'll be interesting.
Knowledge has made you powerful, but there's still so much you don't know.
Okay, so that Red Priestess, we saw her in the trailer for this whole season. Super interesting because she's dealing with Tyrion, talking about how much they don't know. So when I was talking about the prophecies earlier about Daenerys, and she's there in Meereen now, so we've got this Red Priestess. Clearly she's meant to kind of remind us of Melisandre, but Red Priestesses in general would. But Melisandre is paired with Jon Snow right now and is treating him like Azor Ahai, the prince that was promised. Clearly he's the hero that fulfills the prophecy in Melisandre's eyes, and that's why she's tied to him. It's really interesting to see one in Meereen, this episode specifically, because like I said earlier, these were supposed to be mirrored images of these rebirths where Jon is reborn through ice and Daenerys is reborn through fire at the end of this episode. So the Red Priestess in Meereen, it reminds me of back in season 5, the priestess that she was like an Asian Red Priestess from Volantis, and she was saying Daenerys was the savior that they've been waiting for. And I believe in the prophecy there is something about being, reborn in smoke. We just saw that from Daenerys. I think I think this would be at least very cool if this Red Priestess is all like, oh yeah, Daenerys, Azor Ahai, the prince that was promised, and Melisandre is like, no, Jon Snow, because that we all talk about oh, are those two going to end up together? And instead, what if they both either are the fulfillment of the prophecy or have to fight to decide who's going to be the fulfillment of the prophecy? I don't know, but that's just excites me to see a Red Priestess in Meereen just after Daenerys just showed she kind of is a superhero. But yeah, moving on.
Bran, wake up!
Amazing. Okay, so Bran is doing his warging thing, and the Night's King can see him, and it looks like all those whites can see him. Those whites look to me like the whites from Hardhome, so I don't think that's an super ancient thing he's looking at. Some people were asking me that, oh, is he just seeing, the beginning of White Walkers or something? It's maybe, but this moment feels like he's in the present just seeing the White Walkers that are currently around and currently coming. But really interesting, something that nobody's asked me about. Mira is like, Bran, you gotta wake up, you gotta wake up. What's going on at the tree? Because she can't warg, she's not seeing what's in his eyes. So that means danger or something? That's what I'm absolutely the most pumped for in the next episode. It's called The Door, and the doorway between these worlds, and it feels like an episode that we're gonna learn at least more about the Night's King or something like that. It's also episode 5, which is always such a big episode. I'm realizing that I tend to ramble more in these sections where I just watch this preview for next episode. So maybe I shouldn't put these in this video, but I'm super pumped for next week's episode, mostly based on the White Walker scene, just tag right there at the very end. I cannot wait to see it. But okay, some lingering questions. One, what do you think of this theory about Cersei's secret plan for the Tyrells and the Faith Militant? Knowing the way that Game of Thrones goes, these neat, tidy rescue missions always seem to end up with a few major characters dying. We'll see what happens. Just tell me what you think about that theory. 2, another callback that I didn't didn't reference is The Bear and the Maiden Fair, where the Maiden Fair was Brienne, and we have a new bear with Tormund. Are they this show's new power couple? Like, yeah, I'm shipping for it. But also, wasn't Tormund like known for sleeping with bears or something? Or am I making that up? I don't know. But do you think that these two are actually gonna get together? I would love it. Okay, and 3, what do you think of Tyrion's Lincoln-esque compromise? I don't know if you caught this, but the Dothraki khals mentioned that the Yunkai offered 10,000 horses in exchange for Dany. That means the slavers know that Dany is not actually in control of Meereen, so they know that he was BSing him. So yeah, maybe war is happening and Tyrion can't help it. Or maybe not. Maybe he's averted the whole thing. What do you think's gonna happen there? Is he that good of a negotiator? Did he prevent a civil war? Okay, that's it. I'm done with this episode's breakdown. Make sure to check out all our other breakdowns though, episodes 1 through 3 of this season. I explain a lot of the fan theories that are going around, and we're gonna probably reference them as we go. So if you still need to understand stuff a little bit better, definitely go back and check those out. And if you like this video, hit like on it, but please share it constantly. That's always my request. If you can let other Game of Thrones fans know about these videos, I would love to expand our little clique we have going. Subscribe to this channel so you also get them as they come. And also we're gonna do some more new content pretty soon. So you want that too. Follow us on Twitter at New Rockstars to find out when that new content is coming out. Follow me on Twitter at Fimo. You can have full-on nerdy tweets at me if you want to have longer conversations. Facebook, it's facebook.com/FimoKnows. This is a lot of stuff to say at the end of a video, so I'm just gonna see you next time. Bye.